what we really believe will always come through. And if we're not honest about it, it comes through in ways that are less positive. So that kind of concludes the intro section of this. So I'm going to move into kind of the topic for this week, which is what is reality? And I'm going to be talking about a number of well-known philosophers. I'm going to start off with a philosopher named Plato. And even if you're not somebody who's ever studied philosophy, Plato's a name that most people know. So he's probably the most famous philosopher of the what we call the Western world. A lot of times when people mention ancient Greece and ancient Rome, they mention it with a white supremacist agenda. So I think it's important to kind of take a moment to unpack that a little bit. One of the things to realize is that neither Greece or Rome was, quote, white as we understand white today. Those were not concepts that would have made sense to them. And actually, Rome was a very multiracial society. So they had people of all colors there, and they had citizens of all colors. And for Greece, like our current notions of race wouldn't make sense because for them, there were people, and we would say, oh, you're all Greek. But for them, this is like, these people are from Athens, these people are from Macedonia, and those are two completely different societies in their mind. I do also want to mention that Socrates, by his own account, was a student of a priestess from Egypt named Diotima. And that's something that's often not talked about a lot. Talk to people in the academy and you say, well, what about Diotima? They say, well, she was just fictional. But when you ask, like, well, what's the reason for you thinking that she's fictional? It really comes down to that they don't want to believe that Socrates could have learned something from a woman from Egypt. He talks a lot about her in his book called The Symposium. So if you ever read The Symposium, go hear about Diotima. One of the things about Plato is that he was kind of the link in a really interesting chain of people. Because he was a student of Socrates, who I said was very famous, but we know him now largely because of what Plato said about him. He was the teacher of a man named Aristotle that became an even more famous philosopher for a long time. And then Aristotle had a student who was not known as a philosopher, but who was very influential, and his name was Alexander. And a lot of people know him more as Alexander the Great. And Alexander the Great conquered much of that region at the time. And the reason that that's interesting to me is because you often find that philosophy precedes empire. As Phil said earlier, that ideas are important, that ideas make a difference, and that until you can fix something, you can't bring it into the world, you can't achieve it. For many years, the standard interpretation of Plato was the one that Aristotle gave. And Aristotle kind of went through, he said, my teacher, he was a great man, I loved him, but if you notice, like, pretty much everything he said was kind of wrong. And he would just go through and he would take a look at Plato's theories and he would just point out, here's an error, here's an error, here's an error. And he was like, fortunately, we have somebody smarter to fix this. And you get Aristotelian philosophy, which is basically the fixed version of Platonic philosophy. And for a long time, that was philosophy to the world. And it was actually interesting because 600 years later, there was another person, and it seems like 600 years feels like a really long time, and it was a really long time at that time, but this was still the time of ancient Rome. So there's a man named Plotinus, and he lived in ancient Rome, and he studied Plato. I really admire him because he had the courage to say, I think that people have been getting this wrong for 600 years. And he said, maybe it's not that this guy Plato was just making all these mistakes and that these mistakes had to be fixed. Maybe he had a reason that he said things the way he did. And he received a different set of messages in Plato. So he went back through each of Plato's dialogues and he said, there's a hidden message in each of these dialogues. The question then is, why would Plato have done it that way? Why didn't he just come out and tell people? You know, there's a famous method called the Socratic method, which Plato learned from Socrates. And Socrates did not tell anybody anything. He only asked questions. And that was his method. And it was exactly for the reason that you said, because he wanted people to figure out things for themselves. And a lot of times we can't hear things, we can't absorb things unless we figure them out for ourselves. So I was talking a little bit earlier about the founder, the patriarch of the space, Ernest Gilbert Jr. And he and I used to have a lot of philosophical conversations. And one thing I found very early with him was that if I told him something straight out and he understood it, he would quit listening to it. Mm-hmm. Because for him, the challenge was figuring it out. And once he had understood it, there was no point in him figuring it out, spending any more time thinking about it. So I realized that if I wanted him to think about something, I had to make it a puzzle. Because if it was a puzzle, he would spend as long as it took to figure it out. And that's the work of Plato. Each of Plato's dialogues is a puzzle box. And the point of the puzzle box is to make you work to get to the heart of it. For me, kind of the big opening into philosophy was actually one of Plato's dialogues, a dialogue called the Meno. And the idea of the Meno is that Socrates is trying to explain something to somebody, and he goes through this whole thing, and he has this boy, and he shows the boy a math problem, and he makes the boy solve the problem himself. And then there's this kind of superficial ending to it, and I thought I understood it, and like Ernest, like once I understood it, I just kept on moving. I wrote my little essay about it, and I handed it to my professor, and then he said words that changed my life. He said, "Do you think that's what he really did? Do you think that's what he really?" And I said, "Oh, of course, that's what he said." He said, "That's what he said, but is that what he meant?" And so I went back and I realized that there was a whole different set of meanings. And it was really a key to me to philosophy because I learned that a lot of philosophy all over the world is like that. That if you read it and we get only superficial meaning, that you haven't really gotten down to the heart of it. What is it that Plato is hiding? And I would encourage people to kind of look for yourself and come up with your own answers. But I'm going to be a little less subtle than Socrates. I'm going to come right out and tell you what I think Plato is trying to tell us. He's saying that there's another level of reality. And that the level of reality that we experience every day is not the true and final level of reality. And that there are things more real than ordinary physical things that is here around us. A lot of times we call this idealism. And people who have this belief are often described as mystics or mystical philosophers. And there are mystics all over the world. And they have different ways of talking about things, but they share this sense that what we think of as ordinary reality is not ordinary reality. One of the other famous people who kind of was along this line was Descartes. Descartes was a French philosopher. And one of the things he asked was, how do we know that what we see all around us is real? How do we know it's not just a dream? A lot of people nowadays are more familiar with the movie The Matrix. And The Matrix posited that we live in a world that's a computer simulation. Things have actually made that more plausible rather than less plausible, I would say. Because at the time when the movie was made, it was just pure science fiction. But we now live in a time where it's possible that we have ultra-realistic video games. If you ever played like a modern video game, it looks like a movie. You can have a simulation where you see the simulated figure and it looks like a person, it talks like a person. It may seem like it's having its own ideas and thoughts, but it's simulated. I think it becomes more plausible than ever before that the reality we live in might not be the final level of reality. There's the story of a famous conversation. There were two philosophers. This was in England. And one of them was named Bishop Berkeley. And Bishop Berkeley had this belief that everything exists in the mind of God, that we all exist in God's thoughts. And there's another philosopher, and his name was Samuel Johnson, and he thought that was complete nonsense. And they were asking him, well, what do you think of Bishop Berkeley's new book? He's like, it's complete crap. And they said, well, how do you refute it? how do you refute it? And he says, I refute it thus. And he kicked a rock. And he said that was his proof that the real world existed, was that he kicked the rock was solid, and that all of Bishop Berkeley's talk was just gases in the air. But the thing is that for us, these days, we know that you can put on a virtual reality suit and you can see what looks like a rock. And if they've programmed it correctly, you can kick and you feel like some kind of sensation and you feel like you kicked something, but that it's simulated. If we are at a place we can do that now, it becomes more plausible that we could be living in a technologically created world. That is one of the things that brings us closer, I'd say, in our period of time to the place that Plato was, where he would look around the world and think that what he was seeing may not be the final level of reality. For Plato, what was real? For Plato, the things that were real were things like love, truth, justice, and beauty. Those were the real things. And it's interesting what a distance we come from that, because in the modern estimation, those things are the least real things. We think of those as just concepts, they're just things. But for Plato, those were the foundational things of reality. I think that it's important to get back to those things because those are the places where we find renewal. There's a very kind of famous story outline called The Hero's Journey. So the hero's journey is this idea that there are stories all over the world and that they follow a similar pattern, which is that somebody leaves the ordinary world. They go into what's sometimes the underworld or another realm, and that they have to fight past a lot of dangers, and then they finally get to this place where it's like a crystal fountain or elixir of life or something, and then their job is to bring that back. And that when they do that, it creates a time of renewal for the world. And I've come to view that story as a metaphor for the job of the philosopher. The job of the philosopher is to go down into a deeper level of reality, the one that's not accessible to most people, to get past the dangers and to find what is renewing to the world. And I think that the dissolute state of the world is a sign that we've been too long away from those sources of renewal, that we're too disconnected. Plato's Cave is probably the most famous work of philosophy in Western philosophy. And it's a story that he tells. And the story is that there's a cave full of people, and they're chained up, and all they can do is look forward. And there's a fire behind them, and the fire is casting shadows on the wall. And because they can't see anything but the shadows, they think the shadows are reality. So they see the shadows pass, and they learn to really interpret these shadows, and they become experts in the shadows, but they don't know anything about the real things that are casting the shadows. And something that Plato said is that if somebody becomes freed from it, if they're able to come out of the cave, if they're able to see the sunlight, first thing is the sunlight's going to blind their eyes. But if they ever go back into the cave, they're going to seem to people in the cave like they're crazy, because they're talking about things that the people in the caveman have experienced and that the people in the cave didn't understand. And he said that their eyes will have been blinded by the light, so they won't be able to perceive the shadows as well. There's definitely dangers in it. I don't want to say that it's without dangers. And there's a quote from Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was a anthropologist who talked a lot about the hero's journey, which was a story outline that I talked about before. And he said the psychotic drowns in the same waters that the mystic swims in. And it means that once you let go of the ordinary levels of reality, it could be dangerous and be a dangerous place to be, because you're no longer closely alive with the things that other people are seeing. The reason that this becomes powerful is because when you understand that not everything that's presented as reality is actually real, it makes a lot of things that otherwise don't make sense in the world make a lot more sense. And I think we're seeing that playing out in the world right now, because there are a lot of things that people thought of as really solid and real and stable that we find out are not so much so. The Constitution of the United States is something that is always viewed as like this bedrock. But we're seeing that the people with enough wealth want things to change. they can change those things. In some ways, that can be very disconcerting to people, and they can see that as entirely negative. But there are also positive sides to that, because there's power if you can see past illusions. One of the things that, to me, is one of the big shadows on the cave wall right now is something they call cryptocurrency. So cryptocurrency is supposed to be a new substitute for dollars, and there are bitcoins, and now there are these things called Dogecoin. They're things that have value because people think they have value. The insight that people had when they created Bitcoin or created Dogecoin is that even the things that we think of as money, the dollar bills, those only have value because we believe they have value. A lot of the source of the power of the people who are oppressing the nation right now is in this vast amount of money that they have. But all this money that's in cryptocurrency, that would disappear tomorrow if everybody quit believing in cryptocurrency. It's important to remember that the foundation of that is ideals. It's not even as solid as the rock that Samuel Johnson kicked. You know, a lot of people see the nation as being under shadow, but it's also important to remember that the shadow can only block the light. The shadow is not the light. As it says in the Bible, it says the shadow cannot comprehend the light. And that has a double meaning of the shadow cannot understand the light, but also the shadow cannot overcome the light. One of the things that I think is a positive about the era we're in, it's compelling us to wake up. Because there's a lot of things that we have deliberately put ourselves to sleep around. There are a lot of aspects of this country that have always been negative, but that we were able to turn a blind eye to because they were not impacting us directly at that moment. But this is a period of time, I think, where the masks are off, that helps us potentially reorient around things that are more stable, are more lasting, are more real. For me, coming here and doing this tonight, this is something I thought about for years, but the reason that I'm actually doing it now is because I felt that there was a necessity of the moment. That I did not have the luxury of the time to not do the things that I do. As I said earlier, it's my belief that each person has something in them that they're called to do, something that they're supposed to do. And we can put those things off for years, but I think the present moment is telling us that we should not put those things off any longer. I've talked to a lot of people recently who have been in a state of hopelessness, and they felt really like there's nothing that they can do. They feel hopeless, they feel helpless. That's a self-defeating way of thinking, but it's also, in some ways, I think it's a selfish way of thinking. And it's an inaccurate way of thinking because each one of us in this room has a lot of resources at our disposal. I think about ancestors of mine who were held in conditions of enslavement. I think about ancestors of mine who were in internment camps and how circumscribed their lives were, how few resources they had, how few options they had open to them, and how they still managed to fill lives and make a difference even despite those obstacles. So it seems very self-indulgent for me, with so many more resources than they have, to say that I'm powerless, to say that I'm unable to do something. One of the important things that we can do is philosophy itself, because I think that ideas are really important. It was, for me, this was a moment where I had to say, do I really believe this? Do I really believe that the most important thing I could do is change people's minds? And I really do feel that. So that this is what I'm doing in this note. And I feel it's important for each person to find what that thing is. I want to give you, this is a piece of biblical poetry. This is Psalm 73, and it's a psalm that I've been thinking about a lot. I think that even though it was written a very, very long time ago, it speaks very much to the present moment that we're in. God is good, no doubt, no question. Good to the ones that stay true, who walk in his justice, who hold tight to what's right. But me, I almost fell. I almost let go because I looked at the powerful, the ones who move through this world untouched, untested, unshaken. And I started to wonder, They don't struggle like we do.
Mhm.
No hunger in their bellies, no weight on their backs. Their money shields them. Their names protect them. They wear arrogance like designer clothes. Violence drips from their tongues like honey. They mock us, they trample us, they steal and call it success. And the people follow, blind, desperate, hoping for a taste of that untouchable life. And these oppressors, they laugh in our faces. They say, "Where is your God? If he's real, why doesn't he stop us?" And the worst part, they keep on winning. They stack riches like mountains while we scrape for crumbs. I started to wonder, was I a fool to stay righteous? To keep my hands clean? To keep my soul untainted? Because all it's gotten me is suffering. All I see is pain. But then, I stepped into the presence of God and I saw the truth like fire in the dark. These so-called kings, these untouchables, they're standing on cracking ice. Thin as a whisper, weak as a lie. One slip and they're gone. Ripped from their thrones, swallowed in the storm of justice. They think they own the world, but they are a breath. Here then gone. Like a bad dream, they will vanish, forgotten in the light morning. Hi friends, this is Chris Tsunami. Thanks for joining me for the first major topic of my Philosophy is Activism lecture series, What is Reality? The intro video was posted a few days ago, and the conclusion of this lecture, Katoba's Dream, should be posted shortly. If you're in or near Columbus, Ohio, and watching this in March or April of 2025, feel free to come join us in person for the remainder of the series, alternate Wednesdays at 7 p.m. at the Copper Chest Cultural Center. Details are at katoba.com. That's KITOBA.com. Wednesday, March 19th will be the next lecture on the topic of religion as technology. I'd also like to encourage you to check out my books. The Partially in Zen Life was created in collaboration with the popular philosophy podcast of the same name. It's an entertaining and accessible introduction to philosophy from all around the world. Hero for Christ is a guide to putting faith into action for those who really want to follow the revolutionary message of Jesus. These can be purchased on Amazon or requested for order at any bookstore. I'd like to thank the host for these lectures, the Royal Oak Institute Chess Program. If you'd like to become a member of the organization or just to support their mission of bringing chess to the Center City, please check them out at theroichess.org. That's TheRoiChess.org. Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at the next lecture.